Imagine being dragged into court, not as a person, but as a pig, a dog, a barrel of beer, or a swarm of insects. This video isn't about myths or jokes. These are 44 real court cases where medieval judges seriously tried animals, objects, food, and even nature itself. This is what happened when the law completely lost touch with reality. 1. The legal system in 1386. France decided to turn a standard courtroom into a high-end fashion runway when a sow was arrested in Falaise. But the trial itself isn't the crazy part. It is how they treated the defendant. The court ruled that if the animal was going to face the full weight of the law, it had to look the part of a human citizen. They literally hired a tailor to dress this confused pig in proper human-style clothing, because apparently, if an animal was going to be judged under human law, it had to look the part. Contemporary accounts describe the court making serious efforts to humanize the defendant so the proceedings would feel legitimate. To top it all off, the jailer billed the taxpayers for the pig's daily meals at the same luxury rate as a human prisoner, meaning this pig was eating better than most of the peasants watching the trial. 2. The Cadaver Synod of 897 is the ultimate proof that you should never hold a grudge because Pope Stephen VI literally put a dead body on trial just to prove a point. He hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, so much that he had the man dug up 7 months after the funeral, dressed him in full papal robes, and propped him up on a throne. Stephen spent the entire day screaming at the silent, slumping corpse, accusing it of perjury and illegal ambition, while a terrified teenage deacon crouched behind the chair to answer guilty on behalf of the dead guy. It was like a terrible ventriloquist act where the puppet is a former pope. The corpse obviously lost the debate, proving that remaining silent isn't always the best legal strategy. 3. In 1601, a horse named Morocco became the most famous defendant in France because he was simply too good at math. Morocco could count coins, dance on 2 legs, and answer questions by tapping his hoof. So naturally, the religious authorities arrested him for witchcraft. They were convinced the horse was possessed by a demon because no animal should be smarter than the average French peasant. The owner, facing the death penalty for being a wizard, saved his life by dragging the horse into the courtroom and making it perform specifically for the judge. He proved that he was controlling the horse with subtle hand signals, not black magic. The judge was so impressed by the dumb explanation that he acquitted them, effectively ruling that it wasn't Satanism, just a very talented show pony. 4. A lawyer named Bartholomew Chasseneuil became the absolute legend of the 16th century legal world by defending a massive swarm of rats against the church. The rats of autumn were summoned to court for eating the barley crop, but naturally, they failed to show up. Chasseneuil argued that his clients lived in many different villages and hadn't received the memo, so the court actually reissued the summons. When the rats still ghosted the trial, Chasseneuil played his ace card and claimed the roads to the courthouse were heavily patrolled by cats, the mortal enemies of his clients. He successfully argued that a defendant cannot be legally forced to appear in court if their life is in immediate danger. The judge actually agreed with this logic and adjourned the case indefinitely. 5. In 1591, the Russian city of Uglitch witnessed the only case in history where a metal object was sentenced to exile in Siberia. The town's church bell had been rung to signal a riot, and when the Tsar regained control, he decided the bell was the ringleader of the rebellion. He didn't melt it down. He punished it like a human traitor. The executioner publicly tortured the bell by cutting off its ears, the metal loops it hung from, and ripping out its tongue, the clapper. Then, the silent, mutilated bell was formally banished and dragged hundreds of miles to Siberia to serve a life sentence in prison. It remained in exile for over 300 years before finally being pardoned, proving that the Russian justice system holds a grudge longer than anyone else. 6. Biology and logic were completely thrown out the window in 1474 when the city of Basel, Switzerland, decided to put a rooster on trial for the terrifying crime of laying an egg. The townspeople were absolutely convinced that this so-called cock's egg was a magical object that would hatch into a cockatrice, a mythical beast with laser vision. The prosecution argued that the rooster had clearly signed a binding contract with the devil, because roosters don't just swap genders without some dark magic involved. The defense lawyer valiantly argued that laying the egg was an involuntary bodily function, but the court wasn't taking any chances. They sentenced the bird and the egg to be removed from society via a large bonfire, while the entire town celebrated their narrow escape from a creature that only existed in their imagination. 7. Forget modern marriage counseling. Medieval Germany had divorce by combat, and it was exactly as insane as it sounds. If a husband and wife couldn't resolve a dispute, the court would order them to fight it out in a duel to see who God supported. To make it fair, the husband had to stand in a waist-deep hole in the ground with one hand tied behind his back, armed with a wooden club. The wife was allowed to move freely around the hole and was armed with a sack filled with heavy rocks. It was a state-sanctioned domestic violence spectator sport where the judge acted as a referee. If the husband managed to pull the wife into the hole, he won. If she bashed him with a rock sack until he gave up, she won. It was brutal, ridiculous, and probably solved fewer marriages than it ended. 8. You might think you can't sue a geological formation, but the people of Chamonix proved you wrong when they took the local glaciers to court. In the 16th century, the massive walls of ice were expanding and crushing potential farmland, so the villagers hired a lawyer to file a restraining order against the frozen water. The bishop was called in to perform a rite of exorcism to stop the ice from advancing, effectively yelling at a mountain to back off. The wildest part is that the legal team argued that the glacier was trespassing on private property without a permit. The villagers truly believed that if they had the right paperwork, the forces of nature would have to respect the property lines. When the glacier eventually retreated years later, the lawyers took full credit. 9. We have the fashion police today, but in 15th century London, it was a literal government department that would arrest you for wearing shoes that were too cool. The trend at the time was poulaines, shoes with ridiculously long, pointy toes that sometimes extended 5 inches past the foot. The king decided these shoes were offensive to God and likely hindered people from kneeling in prayer, so he passed a law making it a criminal offense to wear them. The police would patrol the streets carrying small rulers to measure people's feet. If your shoe point was over 2 inches long, you were fined, and the tips of your shoes were publicly chopped off by the town blacksmith, which is the most aggressive way to enforce a dress code in human history. 10. One of the longest legal battles in history didn't involve kings or queens, but a colony of weevils that were sued by the town of Saint Julien for destroying the vineyards. This trial dragged on for decades, literally outlasting the original judge, as the insects had a court-appointed lawyer who took his job incredibly seriously. The town eventually realized they couldn't just excommunicate bugs, so they offered a compromise: a specific plot of land outside the village where the weevils could live and eat in peace. It sounds like a great deal, but the lawyer for the weevils actually sent experts to inspect the land and rejected the offer. He argued in court that the designated soil was too barren and sandy for his client's refined tastes, proving that bureaucracy has always been a complete nightmare, even when you are just a bug. 11. King Henry VIII is famous for his 6 wives, but his war on facial hair was equally ridiculous. In 1535, he introduced a beard tax, which turned having a chin strap into a luxury service. The amount you had to pay depended on your social status, meaning that growing a beard was a legal flex to show you were rich enough to afford the tax. The absurdity is that Henry himself had a massive beard, but he exempted himself from the law because he was the king. It created a society where police could stop you on the street not to check your ID, but to measure your facial hair and check if you had the receipt for your mustache. 12. The most intense courtroom drama in history happened in 1371 when the King of France ordered a trial by combat between a man and a dog. A knight named Chevalier Macaire was accused of murdering a courtier, and the only witness to the crime was the victim's greyhound, which attacked Macaire every time it saw him. Since the dog couldn't testify verbally, the king decided the only logical solution was to let them fight to the death to see who was telling the truth. They put Macaire in an arena with a heavy wooden club and gave the dog an empty barrel to use as a hiding spot. The crowd watched as the dog dodged the swings and eventually dragged Macaire to the ground, forcing him to confess. It remains the only time in legal history where the prosecution's star witness also served as the executioner. 13. In 1685, the town of Ansbach, Germany, reached the absolute peak of paranoia when they arrested a wolf that they believed was the reincarnation of their recently deceased mayor. The locals didn't just want to get rid of the animal, they wanted to humiliate the politician inside it. In a move that looked more like a bizarre theater production than a legal proceeding, they dressed the wolf in a professionally tailored suit, complete with a powdery wig and a velvet mask that resembled the mayor's face. They then paraded the well-dressed animal through the town square so everyone could mock it. It wasn't about violence. It was about sending a fashion-forward message to the spirit world that the town was under new management, and the old mayor had terrible taste in bodies. 14. The village of Vanvres in 1750 saw the most bizarre character witness in history during a trial involving a man and a female donkey. The man was caught doing unspeakable things with the animal, and while he was swiftly sentenced to death, the donkey's fate hung in the balance. The local priest and several leading citizens actually signed a formal document testifying to the donkey's virtue and good behavior over the last 4 years. They argued she was a model citizen who had always been kind, hard-working, and had never caused a scandal before this incident. The court accepted this certificate of good character, and the donkey was acquitted and released back into the pasture with her reputation fully restored, proving that in France, a donkey with good references has more rights than a creepy human. 15. Medieval England had a legal concept called deodand that basically allowed the government to arrest inanimate objects for murder. If a peasant fell off a ladder and died, the ladder was legally considered the killer. The object would be arrested, put on trial, and forfeited to God, which usually meant sold by the king for cash. In one famous instance, a man was run over by a cartwheel, so the court arrested the wheel. They didn't arrest the driver who was steering. They blamed the specific piece of wood that made contact. The wheel was found guilty of homicide and confiscated. It creates a hilarious mental image of a sheriff putting handcuffs on a wagon wheel and reading it its rights, while the actual driver just stands there awkwardly whistling and looking away. 16. In the 17th century, a monastery in Brazil got into a heated property dispute with a colony of termites that were eating the foundations of their church. Instead of just exterminating them, the friars filed a civil lawsuit against the bugs. The court appointed a lawyer for the termites, who actually put up a brilliant defense. He argued that the termites were the original inhabitants of the land. They were just trying to feed their families, and they were much more industrious and hardworking than the lazy monks. The judge was so impressed by this argument that he ruled in favor of the termites. He ordered the monks to provide a designated pile of timber for the bugs to eat so they wouldn't have to chew on the church, marking the only time in history a bug has successfully claimed squatters' rights. 17. The biggest get-out-of-jail-free card in history was a legal loophole called the benefit of clergy, which turned reading into a superpower. In the Middle Ages, church officials were immune to secular courts, so if you were arrested for a crime, you just had to prove you were a clergyman. The test was simple. Read Psalm 51 from the Bible. The absurdity is that criminals quickly realized they didn't actually need to be priests or even know how to read. They just memorized that one specific verse. You had illiterate thugs standing before judges, reciting Latin poetry they didn't understand, and the court had to legally let them go because they passed the test. It became known as the neck verse because knowing those few words was the only thing stopping a rope from going around your neck. 18. We think of hooliganism as a modern problem, but in 1314, King Edward II of England passed a law that made playing football a criminal offense punishable by prison. The medieval version of soccer involved hundreds of people, no rules, and usually ended with broken limbs and property damage. The king didn't care about the injuries, he cared about the noise. He issued a proclamation stating that the great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls was annoying him. It is the only time in history a monarch has legally canceled a sport just because he was acting like a grumpy neighbor who wanted the kids to get off his lawn. 19. Forget grand juries and expensive lawyers. In Anglo-Saxon England, the ultimate legal test was a piece of cheese. It was called the corsned, or the trial by cake. If a priest or nobleman was accused of a crime, he didn't have to provide an alibi. He just had to eat a specific 1-ounce slice of bread or cheese that had been blessed by the church. The legal logic was that if the accused was guilty, God would send an angel to close his throat, and he would choke on the snack. If he swallowed it without gagging, he was innocent. It was literally a carb test for freedom. You can imagine the courtroom tension as a crowd watched a grown man chew incredibly slowly, knowing that a single dry crumb, or a lack of water, could technically count as a confession to murder. 20. The fun police took over England in 1647 when the Puritan government legally abolished Christmas. They didn't just stop the celebrations, they made it a criminal offense to eat mince pies, decorate your home, or attend special church services. Soldiers actually patrolled the streets of London on December 25th to sniff out the smell of cooking goose and arrest anyone looking too happy. The government argued that Christmas was a pagan festival that encouraged drunkenness and bad behavior. For over a decade, celebrating the holidays was an act of civil disobedience, proving that the government was willing to arrest Santa Claus if he showed up with illegal contraband, like pudding and toys. 21. In 16th century Mecca and later in Europe, there was a legitimate legal trial held to decide if coffee was a crime. When coffee first appeared, religious hardliners were terrified of the black mud that made people stay awake and talk too much. They argued it was intoxicating and therefore illegal under religious law, just like wine. The case was brought before the governor of Mecca, who actually put a pot of coffee on trial. He drank it, waited to see if he would turn evil, and when he just got a caffeine buzz, he hesitated. The debate eventually reached Pope Clement VIII in Europe, who was advised to ban the so-called devil's drink. After tasting it himself, the Pope reportedly joked that if this drink was truly so enjoyable, it would be a pity to let only non-Christians benefit from it. 22. We have to talk about the window tax of 1696, which is a perfect example of a government trying to be clever and accidentally ruining architecture. England decided to tax houses based on the number of windows they had, assuming that rich people had more windows. In theory, it was a tax on wealth. In practice, it was a tax on sunlight and fresh air. To avoid paying, people across the country immediately bricked up their windows, turning their homes into dark, airless caves. You can still see old buildings in London today with blind windows, spaces where windows should be, but which are filled with bricks. It was a law that literally made the entire country darker and smellier, just to save a few coins a year. 23. In 1466, the city of Danzig, now Gdansk, held a very serious trial where the defendant was a barrel of beer. The beer was accused of being sour, foul-tasting, and unfit for human consumption, which in medieval times was basically a crime against humanity. The barrel was brought before the magistrate, where experts tasted it and confirmed that it was indeed nasty. The court found the beer guilty of fraud and sentenced it to be publicly executed. The barrel was rolled into the town square, smashed open by the executioner, and its contents were poured into the sewer while the crowd watched. It sends a strong message to all the other beverages that if you don't taste good, the government will literally treat you like a convicted felon. 24. In 1439, King Henry VI of England passed one of the saddest laws in history. He officially banned kissing. This wasn't because he hated romance. It was a desperate attempt to stop the spread of the plague. The king declared that kissing was a health hazard and made it illegal for subjects to kiss as a greeting or even for religious rituals. While the intent was scientific, enforcing the law was a nightmare. You essentially had guards trying to police affection, separating couples and friends in the streets. It is widely considered the least fun law ever passed in England, effectively criminalizing love to save the population from germs. 25. The Spanish town of Córdoba faced a crisis in the 16th century that involved a massive swarm of locusts and a very confused accountant. The locusts were eating all the crops, so the town sued them. But this wasn't just an eviction. The church argued that the locusts were destroying tithes, taxes meant for the church, and were therefore committing financial fraud against God. The judge appointed a defense lawyer for the insects, who argued that since locusts were born on the land, they had squatters' rights to eat the salad. The compromise was pure gold. The judge ordered the town to set aside a specific nature preserve for the locusts to eat in peace, effectively creating the world's first zoning law for bugs who don't pay their taxes. 26. One of the most awkward legal transactions in history was the English custom of wife selling, which was exactly what it sounds like, but somehow stupider. Divorce was technically illegal and too expensive for the poor, so the common people invented a workaround where a husband would put a halter around his wife's neck, lead her to the public market, and auction her off to the highest bidder. It wasn't slavery in the traditional sense. It was a bizarre, semi-consensual performance art to end a marriage. The buyer was usually the wife's new boyfriend, who had prearranged the sale for the price of a pint of beer. The town magistrate would just stand there and watch, accepting this garage sale logic as a valid legal separation because filling out actual divorce paperwork was just too much hassle for everyone. 27. In 1314, a bull in France gored a man, which is a tragedy, but the legal system decided to treat it like a premeditated assassination. The bull was arrested, thrown into a jail cell, and given a trial where witnesses were called to testify against it. After the bull was found guilty and hanged, the town faced a dilemma. A lot of free beef was now hanging in the town square. However, the court ruled that since the bull was a convicted felon, its meat was criminally tainted and could not be eaten by good Christians. They ordered the entire 2,000-pound animal to be burned or buried, wasting a massive amount of food just to prove a point that the cow was a bad person who didn't deserve to end up as a steak dinner. 28. The case of Martin Guerre in 1560 is the ultimate proof that people in the past were just face-blind. Martin left his wife and village in France, and years later, a man returned claiming to be him. The wife accepted him, they lived together for 3 years, and had 2 kids. Then, a soldier walked through town and said, "Hey, that's not Martin, that's Arno. He has a wooden leg." The case went to court, and the imposter almost won by arguing that the soldier was jealous. The trial was only settled when the real Martin Guerre, who also had a wooden leg, dramatically walked into the courtroom at the last second. The wife had to awkwardly explain to the judge how she managed to mistake a complete stranger for her husband for 3 years without noticing that his feet were different sizes. 29. In the 9th century, a swarm of bees in the town of Worms stung a man to death, and the Council of Worms convened to decide the fate of the hive. This wasn't pest control, it was a murder trial. The council ruled that the bees were guilty of homicide, but since you can't put tiny handcuffs on 1,000 insects, they sentenced the entire hive to death by suffocation. But the real kicker was the honey. The council debated whether the honey produced by murderous bees was fit for consumption. They concluded that the honey was the fruit of a criminal enterprise and banned anyone from eating it. They threw away gallons of perfectly good honey because they genuinely believed it might be morally corrupted by the bees' violent behavior. 30. The fishermen of Marseille in 1596 got tired of sharing the ocean, so they filed a massive lawsuit against a pod of dolphins. The fishermen claimed that the dolphins were eating all the good fish and destroying their livelihoods, so they demanded the church intervene. The case was taken to an ecclesiastical court, which actually appointed a defense attorney to represent the dolphins' interests. The lawyer argued that the dolphins had been created by God and therefore had a divine right to eat fish wherever they wanted, and punishing them would be an insult to the Creator. The judges deliberated for a long time, but eventually the dolphins were excommunicated, which supposedly meant they were no longer allowed to swim in those specific waters. It is unclear if anyone actually went out on a boat to notify the dolphins of the verdict. 31. We have to mention the snails of Bern in 1481, because the legal system gave them a warning that would make a modern eviction notice look fast. The snails were destroying the crops, so the bishop issued a formal mandate giving them 3 days to vacate the premises. The logic was that since snails are slow, they needed a head start before the excommunication kicked in. The document was read aloud in the fields, warning the snails that if they didn't pack up their tiny shells and leave by Thursday, they would be cursed by the Almighty. When the snails obviously didn't move because they move at a speed of 3 inches per hour, the church officially cursed them. Reports from the time claim the snails eventually died off, but that was probably due to the changing weather and not because the snails were terrified of the bishop's angry letter. 32. The trial by cold water is the absolute champion of flawed logic, used for centuries to catch witches. The legal theory was brilliantly stupid. Water is a pure element used in baptism, so it rejects evil. They would tie a woman's thumbs to her toes and throw her into a pond. If she floated, the water was rejecting her, meaning she was a witch, and she would be executed. If she sank, the water was accepting her, meaning she was innocent, but she was also usually dead from drowning. It was the ultimate lose-lose game show where the only way to prove you were a good Christian was to inhale a lungful of mud and die at the bottom of a lake while the judges nodded approvingly at your virtue. 33. In 1748, the French Parliament proved that they were terrified of vegetables when they legally banned the cultivation of potatoes. At the time, the French were convinced that potatoes caused leprosy because they grew underground and looked kind of lumpy, which is toddler-level scientific analysis. The law stated that anyone caught growing this poisonous tuber would be fined. It took a pharmacist named Antoine Augustin Parmentier, who had been a prisoner of war and forced to eat potatoes, to prove to the court that he hadn't turned into a leper. He eventually convinced the king to overturn the ban. But for decades, making French fries was technically a criminal act that could destroy your reputation. 34. If you think your neighbors are loud, spare a thought for the Bishop of Lausanne, who in the 12th century decided to sue a pond full of frogs. The frogs were croaking so loudly at night that the bishop couldn't sleep, and instead of just buying earplugs, he treated it as a criminal offense. He took the amphibians to an ecclesiastical court and demanded they cease their insulting noise immediately. The judge actually ruled in favor of the bishop and issued a formal decree ordering the frogs to be silent under penalty of excommunication. It is unclear if the frogs respected the court order, but it definitely goes down in history as the pettiest noise complaint ever filed by a grown man in a funny hat. 35. The Bishop of Lausanne in 1451 decided to pick a fight with a bunch of leeches that were infesting the local ponds, and he treated the situation exactly like a landlord dealing with bad tenants. Instead of just hiring someone to clean the water, the bishop ordered the leeches to be brought to the local magistrate to hear the charges against them. When the leeches failed to show up because they are aquatic worms with no legs, the bishop sent a priest to the edge of the pond to read a formal eviction notice. He gave the leeches 3 days to leave the premises or face the wrath of God. When the leeches inevitably ignored the warning because they don't speak Latin or own calendars, they were formally excommunicated from the church. 36. The English Civil War ended with one of the pettiest acts of revenge in history when the monarchy was restored in 1660. King Charles II decided that Oliver Cromwell, the man who had ruled England as a dictator, needed to be executed for treason. The problem was that Cromwell had been dead and buried for 2 years. That didn't stop the king. He ordered Cromwell's rotting body to be dug up, dragged through the streets of London, and formally hanged at the gallows in Tyburn. After the execution, they cut off his head and stuck it on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it stayed for over 20 years. It was a macabre puppet show, designed to prove that you can't escape the law just by dying. 37. The most compassionate judge in history presided over a case in 1519 involving field mice in the town of Glurns. The mice were destroying the crops, so the town sued them for damages. The judge ruled that the mice had to leave the village immediately, but here is the part that sounds like a joke but isn't. He added a maternity leave clause to the verdict. The judge's official written order stated that pregnant mice and those with infants unable to run were granted a 14-day extension to pack their bags and move out safely. He effectively created a 2-week grace period for rodent mothers, assuming that the mice would read the eviction notice, check their calendars, and politely waddle away once their babies were old enough to travel. 38. The absurdity of financial markets isn't new. Just look at the Dutch tulip mania of 1637, which led to a wave of insane lawsuits. People were trading tulip bulbs for the price of entire mansions, and when the bubble burst, the courts were flooded with cases. You had serious judges trying to resolve disputes where a man was suing his neighbor for defaulting on a contract to buy a single Viceroy tulip bulb for 4,000 florins. The courts were paralyzed because the assets in question were literally rotting flowers. The government eventually had to step in and void most of the contracts, essentially telling thousands of investors that their retirement plan based on garden plants was the stupidest idea in economic history. 39. Medieval courts had a brilliant solution for when they couldn't catch a criminal. They would just build a doll and kill that instead. It was a legal process called execution in effigy. If a murderer escaped from prison, the court would hire an artist to build a life-size straw man or wax figure that looked vaguely like the fugitive. They would then drag this doll into the courtroom, read the full death sentence to its painted face, and march it to the gallows. The executioner would hang or burn the doll with maximum seriousness while the crowd cheered. It was basically a government-funded voodoo ritual designed to make everyone feel better about the fact that the actual bad guy was currently sipping wine on a beach somewhere else. 40. We have to mention the weather trials of the 15th century, where desperate farmers essentially tried to sue the sky. When massive hailstorms destroyed crops in Europe, villagers didn't just pray. They hired lawyers to file charges against the clouds. They believed weather wizards were controlling the storms, but since they couldn't find the wizards, they yelled legal jargon at the thunderstorm itself. The legal team would stand in the field and read long, complex Latin indictments to the hail, demanding it stop trespassing on private property. When the storm eventually passed, because that is how weather works, the lawyers took full credit, claiming the clouds were intimidated by their superior knowledge of property law. 41. In ancient times, the Greeks put a statue on trial for murder, creating the ancestor of the Deodand laws we talked about earlier. A famous athlete had a statue in the town square, and one night, a jealous rival went to whip the statue to insult it. The heavy bronze figure fell over and crushed the man, which sounds like instant karma. However, the court ruled that the statue was guilty of homicide because it had physically caused the death. They sentenced the statue to be thrown into the sea to drown for its crimes. Years later, a famine hit the city, and the oracle told them to bring back the exile, so fishermen had to go dredge the ocean to find the wet, guilty statue and apologize to it. 42. In 1492, the Spanish Inquisition encountered a case that broke their brains involving Rodrigo de Jerez, a crewmate of Columbus. Rodrigo had brought tobacco back from the Americas and was the first man in Europe to smoke it publicly. When people saw smoke coming out of his mouth and nose, his wife naturally assumed he was possessed by the devil, because only dragons and demons breathe fire. The Inquisition arrested him and threw him in jail for witchcraft. He was imprisoned for 7 years for the crime of smoking. The supreme irony is that by the time he was released, smoking had become a massive trend in Spain, and everyone was doing the exact same thing he had been jailed for. 43. In 1804, a man named Francis Smith was put on trial for murder in London, but his defense was that he thought he was shooting a ghost. The Hammersmith area had been panicked by reports of a white ghost attacking people. Smith went out on patrol, saw a figure in all white, and shot him dead. It turned out to be a bricklayer named Thomas Millwood, who was just wearing his white work clothes. The court had to debate the legal precedent of self-defense against the supernatural. The judge eventually ruled that believing in ghosts is not a valid excuse for shooting a bricklayer, setting a vital legal standard that you cannot kill people just because they are dressed like a Scooby-Doo villain. 44. The ultimate no refunds policy was tested in the year 999 AD, when Europe was gripped by the Millennium Panic. Thousands of people were convinced the world would end on January 1st, 1000 AD. In a burst of piety, they donated their lands, homes, and life savings to the church to secure a spot in heaven. When the sun rose on New Year's Day and the apocalypse didn't happen, the donors felt incredibly awkward and stupid. Many actually filed lawsuits against the church to get their property back, claiming the transaction was based on false pretenses. The church essentially replied with, "A deal is a deal," and kept the land, teaching medieval Europe a very expensive lesson about reading the fine print before the end of the world. Now here's the real problem. These weren't idiots or jokes. These were official courts following the law of their time. So tell me this. What absurd legal case, rule, or punishment from history did we miss that belongs in this list? If you know one, drop it in the comments. And if this madness made sense to you, hit like and subscribe. Clearly, you're one of us.